Hello, Kirk. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Okay, I'm doing pretty good, Sheldon, despite the circumstances here. I am in Edmonton this week, and it is cold here. It's dead winter. It's not winter's coming. Winter is here, and tomorrow night is supposed to get down to about to minus 29, minus 30. That's Celsius, which in Fahrenheit would be roughly. Let me see, what would that be? Maybe 15 below zero in Fahrenheit. That's a rough guess. So
It's this time of year where I actually would prefer to measure it in Fahrenheit.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, oh, minus 15. That's not that bad
that's right.
until it hits like minus 40, and then it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. Well, this morning when I had to go for a little trip to see my dad. It was minus 18, which is about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was the way the day started, and it's not getting much warmer today.
Yeah. I just spent a little bit of time dealing with a frozen sump pump hose. So,
Nice. Yeah. Oh, I can't tell you how little I appreciate frozen pipes.
yeah. So, thankfully the sump pump didn't die, but
Yeah.
yeah. That kind of year. It was so nice last weekend. We went from like a foot of snow down to about 3 or 4 inches, and then but it got cold again yesterday, and so this morning I was out there shoveling the driveway. Raining in northern Ontario. Serpa, enjoy the rain. I think what I've got is coming your way though, unfortunately, and yeah, Serpa, where in northern Ontario are you? Yeah, so we are going to be discussing today some science, or at least a little bit of science. Kirk, you want to just go through a little bit of the journey Dowling, Ontario? Have you been up to Dowling?
I've been through Dowling. Isn't that between Sudbury and North Bay?
It's not on my map of the world. I don't know why.
I will say one thing though, just a matter of warning. My mic seems to be randomly muting for not even touching stuff. So I may have to switch mics if this keeps up.
All right. Yeah, so sorry those of you who are watching. Kirk's in out of his normal area, and so we're working off technology that isn't quite as high quality as he normally has. North of Sudbury. Yep. I'm out in Steinbach, so yeah, anything I've got is coming your way eventually here. And let's just say you're going to want to get your toque and parka and stuff ready. Okay, so Kirk, you're reading the news the other day. Something comes across your phone and sort of piques your interest. So what happened?
Well, first of all, I should say that I am already a scientist. So I'm speaking from the perspective of a scientist who's been in the halls of science for literally a few decades. But I was reading this news article, and it was about this fellow who was an atheist, and his father had recently died, and his parents were very religious, and he observed that they seemed to have a lot of comfort when a loved one would die because they sort of had some idea what would happen in the afterlife. But he didn't have any such thing. So he ended his article by saying, it'd be nice to have that if you believed in it, but really at the end of the day, he had and he explicitly stated that he felt it was much better to put his faith in science rather than in religion or something else or in the existence of God. It's kind of a vague. He didn't really go into it in too much detail. Well, from a scientific perspective, I thought, wow, that's too bad. I don't think people have a good, clear idea of modern science and just what a minefield it is of good science, bad science, and an outright fantasy. So that's the starting point for what I says. Let's do a podcast on this today and just take a look at modern science and see if it's worth putting your faith in. It's not usually a question of all or nothing, by the way, because I also have a deep, devout faith in God through Jesus Christ. But I also have a lot of faith in what in science properly done. And
Yeah,
so it's
so maybe that's where we need to start, Kirk, because if we actually define some things, I think that'll head off a lot of the concern as we go here. Because first, let's define the word faith. In my view, faith is all about trust.
yeah, there's a lot of it's trust is a very important component of it, but I should say that there's a false view of faith that is being promoted by Richard Dawkins and others. In their view, their definition of faith is a complete blind leap in the dark with absolutely zero evidence of anything to substantiate what your belief is in. And that is so, I would call that insanity. I wouldn't call that faith. But that's the way it's portrayed. And it's portrayed such that if I have any evidence to support my faith, then it's not faith anymore. And that's just a completely fallacious view of faith. So you mentioned trust, Sheldon. It is trust on the basis of what you know, that there is some level of trust there. So I'll give you two examples. I'll give you a religious example and I'll give you an engineering example. So a religious example would be, how do I know, or what rational justification do I have for believing that God exists? And so I would look at the origin of the universe. It exploded into existence out of absolutely nothing at all. And so if nature had a beginning, whatever caused nature to come into existence cannot be natural itself. We're talking about something not natural or supernatural. So that doesn't necessarily define God very well, but it does eliminate a natural explanation for the origin of nature just using cold hard logic. And therefore we're left with, well, it looks like something that's totally non-natural here, something not dependent on space-time, matter, and energy, or the laws of physics, produced space-time, matter, and energy, and the laws of physics. So that would be an example of justified faith. Doesn't prove that God exists, but logically it gives you a pretty sound basis to begin to reason towards or infer the existence of God. And you could go on from there. You could look at design in the universe. You could then look at the historical evidence for the existence of God centering around an individual who actually claimed he was the creator of the universe, God himself, which was Jesus of Nazareth. And so you would say, well, what rational grounds do I have for thinking he was telling the truth, or that we've got a reasonably accurate record of what he even said? And that's another investigation. And then you find your evidence and your grounds, and then you inductively infer your conclusion. Now, inductive inference is something that it's not proof. It's more like the evidence seems to point to this, or it seems to be a probable explanation or a plausible one. That's an inductive inference. An abductive inference is where you reason to the best explanation. So you might have two or three options, and which option actually fits the facts that you do know about best. So all this to say is that a proper, healthy religious faith does have some rational justification for it. And if it's just a blind leap in the dark, that's full of pitfalls, full of problems. You could believe in a fence post and think that's the creator of the universe if you just wanted to take a blind leap in the dark. Now, let me give you a scientific example, because a lot of people think that science and faith are mutually exclusive and never the twain shall meet. But here's an example. So I worked on part of my career. I was an experimental test engineer for a major aircraft engine company. And I was in a group of engineers responsible for coordinating the build and test of experimental aircraft engines. So I helped develop a particular aircraft engine, the PW100, it was called at the time. I personally witnessed that engine explode, I think it was 3 times, 3 different occasions in the test cell. And when a PW100 turboprop engine explodes, you don't want to be sitting anywhere near that when that happens. If it happens on the wing of an airplane, it could actually take the wing off if it was bad enough, and you'd crash. Since that time, however, I have flown on many aircraft that used the engine that I helped develop a number of years ago. Now, I know as an engineer, I cannot say with 100% surety that I will get to my destination when I climb on board these aircraft. I have some justification for thinking that it's possible for these engines to explode, but also I know what we did to rectify that problem, to bring the probability of disaster down to so low that we can rationally justify selling it to the public and putting it on aircraft that carry people. Now, when I look at that aircraft as I'm about to embark, I already know in my head there's a probability, quite small, that it'll crash, but the probability that it'll get me to the destination is so high that it's actually probably higher than getting to my destination by car. So I get on the aircraft. Now, when I get on that aircraft, it might be 99 point some percent sure that I'll get to my destination, but that missing part there, that maybe 0.001%, that's where faith comes in. When I get on that aircraft, I'm actually putting my faith in all the work we did, I and my fellow engineers, and then the aircraft company that installed it, in the pilot. I put my faith in them to make up for what I cannot prove. But it's rationally justified, you see. Something much simpler when you sit on a chair. I've seen chairs collapse. Not a lot in my lifetime, but I have seen maybe 4 or 5 examples where somebody sat on a chair, and it was at that moment the chair finally packed it in due to some flaw, and they went crashing to the floor. But the sheer number of people I see sitting in chairs and its visual appearance gives me some evidence to believe that I can actually put my faith in that chair. And faith makes up for the lack of data that I have, that, or the lack of proof. So faith is being assured of something that you cannot necessarily prove with 100%.
And where trust comes in is, sorry, I'm getting feedback here. Where trust comes in is there's an understanding of something that's happened before, or something that you've seen or experienced that makes you want to put your faith in that thing. So if somebody wants to borrow money from me and I've lent the money before, they pay me back, no problem, then I can trust that they're going to pay me back. Faith is when that person has never borrowed money from me before, and I'm having faith that they're going to pay me back. So yeah. There's a bit of that knowledge up ahead of time that's going to move it from faith to, oh, this has happened before. So it's not as.
It's actually a good example when you hear people say, I'm going away on vacation. My neighbors, I have faith in my neighbor that they'll take care of my property, water the plants, and feed the dog. Well, using Dawkins' definition of faith, what that means is I have absolutely zero evidence, not a shred of rational justification, to believe my neighbor would actually do what he said he'd do. But that's not faith. That's just a naive foolishness. When we say we have a lot of faith in somebody, it means that we actually have, we know them well enough so that for this new project or this new responsibility, they will actually carry out what they said. So that's a justified faith, and that's where I think it's important in all areas of life. It's important in religion, it's important in science, it's important in engineering, it's important in interpersonal relationships. Justified faith. Now there is, you mentioned trust. There's actually an ancient quote in the Bible that says, faith without works is dead. So if you say you have faith in something, but you don't actually want to step out and act on that, that's not faith, that's dead. So for example, a number of years ago, this tightrope walker strung a cable across Niagara Falls and demonstrated that he could walk across back and forth. And then he said, who believes I can carry a person across? And a ton of people put up their hand. Yeah, we believe. Okay, then I'd like a volunteer. 0 people put up their hand. So there's a difference between believing that guy can make it across with somebody, and actually putting your faith in the guy, that's where trust comes in. So trust is an essential component of faith.
So, Meraxic Tech, sorry if I can pronounce that username, has a couple things. I want to get to those, but before we do, Kirk, let's move on to another definition. So defining faith, we've sort of done here. Let's define science.
Okay. I think Meraxitech has asked a good question there, and we do need to get back to that. But science. Okay, so modern science actually has three major categories. Some would argue there's four. And I'd like to start with the first category, which is based on the scientific method. So the scientific method, let's say you observe something and you say, hey, I wonder, well, how did that happen? What's going on here? And then on the basis of that observation, you formulate some sort of an hypothesis. You could call it an idea. I have an idea of what caused that over there. Let's say you saw a massive boulder sitting right on top of some bedrock, like you do in Nova Scotia sometimes. Just a monolithic boulder sitting there, completely on a flat terrain. So you have an idea of why that might be there. So the next thing you do in the scientific method is you want to test your idea. So you come up with some way of testing it. You make some predictions. And they need to be the kind of prediction that'll tell you whether you're on the right track, or you can definitely forget about that idea or that hypothesis. And so it needs to be falsifiable if you're going to if it's going to be a good test. The problem with science, the problem with making not science but making a prediction that's not falsifiable is that you might verify it, but it doesn't mean that your idea is true. For example, I was talking with somebody who believed the Earth was flat, and the sun, arcs above the sky, not that far up above us. And one of the predictions they said they could make is that if that's the case, when you have a gap in the cloud, you'll see the rays going like this. Well, there's another reason why the rays will go like that, and if you're familiar with railroad tracks that go to hypothetically infinity, you'll say they also converge, and then as they pass by you. So in either case, the problem with that prediction is it'll get verified either way. So what you have to do is come up with a prediction that if it is falsified, then you know you're on the wrong track. So in science, when we test a hypothesis, we don't prove it if it's verified. All we say is we have verified that hypothesis. That is, we have shown this hypothesis, the prediction has actually come true. It does not follow from that therefore we've proved the theory. Rather, that theory has lived to see another day. We have more confidence in that theory, or more reason to put our faith in that theory, so to speak. But if you make a prediction and that prediction is falsified, then you know that you made a serious mistake. You really do need to go back to square one. So the thing about, I would call that empirical science or experimental science. That's the gold standard in science. It's centered around the scientific method, and it produces results that can actually be reproduced by other people given the same conditions. So they can reproduce those same results and see that the same results occur. When that happens, there's a high degree of accountability in empirical science, because whatever you say you discovered, you have to explain how you arrived at that discovery, how those predictions were verified, and other people can test them. If they're published in a peer-reviewed journal, which hopefully they could be, then they can look at that paper and they can see, let's reproduce this. So that's empirical science, the gold standard, and that's how science originally started. But we have a second category of science now, excuse me, and I would call that inferential science. And that occurs when you have a certain amount of data, where you got some observations, and you arrive at a conclusion that can't be tested. You can't actually set up the experiment and do it all over again. For example, forensic science. Forensic science, let's say they found my fingerprints all over the inside of an apartment that had recently been robbed. Well, you can't actually go back and literally reproduce that situation that occurred, let's say 3 days ago. You can't go back in time. But you can make, it's not a very big inductive leap to conclude that I was in that apartment recently, at least. It doesn't prove that I was the guy who stole the stuff, but it does constitute evidence, and it's an inductive conclusion. Nobody saw me put my fingerprints there. There's other ways your fingerprints can get in an apartment, but the probability that I was there, given that my fingerprints are all over the place, is very high. It's a solid conclusion, or a reasonably good conclusion in science. So a lot of times in science, we may have more than one explanation for a phenomenon, but one of those explanations is highly probable and the others are much less probable. And therefore, we can make a good inductive conclusion. But the bigger the inductive leap, the more sketchy our conclusions become. Now, in court is one way, in a court of justice, one way to test that inductive conclusion. And so in court, there might be 2 or 3 different explanations for the evidence, but the probability that the prosecutor's theory is true is so high, it doesn't leave reasonable doubt anymore. So in court, you typically look for evidence. You have to make an inductive conclusion or an inference to the best explanation, which would be abductive, but it has to be beyond reasonable doubt. So there's still a way. You can't experimentally test it a lot of times, this inductive area of science, but you can look at the probabilities and decide probabilities are saying this did not happen or that this did happen. Now let's see, I started science in 1973. My first degree was in physics. And I would have to say from that point to this day, the golden standard in science, empirical science, I have never found anything that conflicts with faith. That's solid stuff. Now, somebody might argue, what about this? Maybe that'll conflict with faith. I don't know. I'd like to hear it, but that's empirical science where you can actually do the experiment, reproduce the same thing, and come to a conclusion. Inductive science, however, that's where you start to see some discrepancies between faith and science. And then you have to decide which is more likely. And we might look at an example shortly where that comes into play. The last area of science is what I call fantasy science. And there's been a few articles recently over the last few years in Nature, for example. And for those not familiar with Nature, it's probably one of the most prestigious science journals in the world. It's just simply called Nature. But there's one, it was an article in Nature. There's another one in Physical Letter Reviews, if I recall the name of the journal correctly, where certain scientists are standing up and saying, wait a sec, we have a problem in science today, and that's the problem of some of them actually come right out and say this is fantasy. And one of the examples is the multiverse. And another article said, talking about the multiverse as if this is real is actually a threat to modern physics, to the integrity of physics is the way it was worded. It's a threat to the integrity of physics. So what happens? What is fantasy science? Fantasy science is you don't even have any observations or data to back up what you're saying. What you're saying may actually be based on another theory that's not yet been verified. And therefore, this is nothing but science fiction here. And the example of the multiverse is one of them, or Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing, where it's Don Page, another theoretical physicist, points out, wait a sec, this whole theory of Krauss's is based on another theory, which itself is highly debatable. So we have a couple of leaps. It's a pretty big leap to that conclusion, but it's not a leap from good evidence. It's just you basically start with very little, if any, data, and you're speculating now. You're creating mathematical models. And here's something to remember for those who might be really impressed by the fact that somebody made a mathematical model on something and therefore proved something. When we write science fiction, and I'm a big fan of science fiction, actually. I really discovered that in grade 10 or 11. And once I discovered science fiction, I read every sci-fi book in our school library and devoured the local library and so forth. But the thing about good science fiction is that you put words together, you use rules of grammar in English and maybe put a scientific flavor on it for something exploring some planets around another star system, and you create a story. What people do not realize is you can create science fiction from words and rules of grammar. You can also create science fiction from mathematics and rules of mathematics. And so just because it's a mathematical model does not follow that we should actually assign any more credibility to that than we would to, let's say, a great book by my first favorite author back in the day was Andre Norton, or then went expanded to Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and so forth. So the key thing is to move from science fiction to reality is every critical point of a so-called science fiction account must map to something in reality. Same goes for mathematical models. And the problem with creating mathematical models about the universe is that none of them so far actually have all the key points mapping back to reality. And that's not a secret. I mean, I know that Sean Carroll, I watched a presentation by him, and he just comes right out and says, we don't have a mathematical model that actually maps to reality, but they're fun to do. So those are the three major categories of science. Maybe I could add one more. It's not really a category of science, but it's the way the public perceives science as presented in the media and by the government. So governments have some sort of goal in mind, and so they will take papers from journals or maybe no papers at all, and then they will present, we're following the science here. And so that's one thing you always have to be aware of is when you see something in the media, do they have a reference to any peer-reviewed papers in that media article? And if they do, check the paper out to see, have they honestly represented this paper? And for example, I saw one in our national network here last year. They're saying, this is our latest discovery. And oh, that's interesting. And they got a link there. So I checked out the link. And it was a major thing, but they only had a sample size of just over 60 people. And that made national news. And they arrived at a solid conclusion where 60 people for a sample size in the area they were talking about is really a very poor, very low sample size. And you've got to be really careful about extrapolating from a sample size that small.
And what Kirk is saying and what I believe on this is probably the same. If you drill down and you look at the data and you look at the who's funding it, all of those things, regardless of whether it's a science paper or something that's coming out of the theological seminary, like there's biases involved everywhere. Yeah. And so you need to really figure out, who am I putting my faith in when it comes to this this theory or this statement that's being made, whether it's faith or science. It always comes down to, who do you trust? Who are you going to put your faith in? And so one of the things I was thinking about was when somebody says, I put my faith in science, are they putting their faith in the general concept that science exists? Well, I believe science exists. I have a lot of faith that science actually exists. Or are they putting their faith in whatever the latest scientist has come up with to back up their beliefs?
That's an interesting question. When they say they put their faith in science, a lot of times it's somebody who hasn't done a lot of science to begin with. A lot of times it can be that way. It can also be a scientist will say something like that, but that particular scientist is very heavily focused on what we might call empirical science. So when they think of science, they have a much narrower view of science. They're not thinking about some fantasy article about a multiverse or string theory. They're thinking about the kind of work they do. So let's go back to empirical science. When you say you have faith in science, they have this view that these people are actually doing experiments somewhere, and they're doing them well enough that you can actually come to some reproducible and testable and verifiable conclusion. But there's a problem that has arisen even in the gold standard of science, and that is the problem of reproducibility. And Nature had an interesting article several years ago on I think it was 52 landmark papers in cancer research. They weren't just 52 papers in cancer research, but they were labeled as landmark papers, major discoveries. And so an attempt was made to reproduce their results. These results have been published in peer-reviewed papers. And what they found is that only 11% could be reproduced. 89% of those 52 papers could not be reproduced. So the question then was, what's going on here? Is this an anomaly? And a few years later, they published another paper, several years actually later, as they began to look into this, various people saying, what's with this reproducibility problem that Nature uncovered here or published on? Is this normal? Is this an anomaly? And Nature concluded in this second article, this is the norm in certain areas of science, and particularly in the biological sciences, where there's a lot of funding being competed for, and there's a lot of pressure to publish. And the experiments are complex, very complicated, and it's very easy to, in the process of that experiment, which may last months or even in a few years, to just sort of ignore some of the data, focus on other data, and even in your statistical analysis in the end, do some little cooking of the books, so to speak, to get the right answer. And so they concluded, and I quote, this is the norm in at least the biological sciences. That is, the majority of papers that you see peer-reviewed, published in biological journals you will not be able to reproduce those papers.
So I'm going to skip over a couple comments, and I want to address this because, this is as you're talking here. The difference is science admits it makes mistakes, 1,000 mistakes if necessary to arrive at that one correct conclusion. I find this is interesting because science itself can't admit anything.
Well,
scientists can admit they make mistakes, but science is just like Christianity. Christianity itself is a bunch of theories, statements, texts, people. You know, we also have God and stuff in there too, but science is the same thing. Just there's some reproducible effects in it, but science itself shouldn't make mistakes because science is just natural order, is it not?
Well, okay. I think what he's referring to is the people who represent science in this world and our culture will admit that we make mistakes. I say we as scientists, we make mistakes. But it's not necessarily always self-correcting. I took a very interesting course, The Philosophy of Science. And it'd be good for scientists to actually take a course in the philosophy of science and look at how major theories that were false, actually. In fact, I did write an article on this. It's on a different website. It's how somebody fudged one paper, and it started a whole field of discipline, which went on for quite a few years. Thousands of papers were published in this. And then eventually it became obvious that this is not working. And so I think that's a little bit what Miraxtech is referring to, is that eventually, if you've made a bad mistake somewhere, it may go on and multiply, but hopefully it will be discovered eventually, and then we'll have to go back to square one and go off in a different direction. But I think any reasonable person, whether they're in science or politics or theology, soccer coaches, soccer referees, everybody will admit they make mistakes. So the admission of mistakes is a common thing across all fields. It ought to be that I, as a fallible human, misunderstood this, or I forgot about that, or I didn't see that over there. And therefore, we can always be mistaken about something. But if the pressure is high enough, so when Nature went back to say, why are these papers being, why are the majority of papers in the area of biology and medicine, why can't we reproduce these in cancer research, for example? They call it perverse incentives, was the term they used in the article in Nature, perverse incentives. And the perverse incentives meant that basically referring to competition for funding. For example, whenever I publish a paper, you have to acknowledge where the funding came from. So, for example, it's well known that if I'm writing a paper very supportive of a particular new drug and my research was funded by, let's say, Pfizer or Moderna or somebody else, it doesn't necessarily follow from that my results are false. Doesn't follow. But what does follow from that is that I may have been biased in how he did the experiment. This is where human nature comes into play. So the gold standard is a scientific method, and if humans were absolutely ethical and perfect and didn't make mistakes, we would have perfect results. But because human nature wants to compete for funding, the other thing is prestige. There was an example recently that I personally, I actually shared this article with a professor in a senior position at a major university here in North America. And he said, well, funny you should say that, because just a few months ago, a PhD student came in and broke down and started crying in his office. And he said, the student was a foreign student, says, my degree is worth nothing. And so he said, well, what do you mean? This is a prestigious university. And it was in cancer research, by the way. What do you mean? And he says, everything we do in our lab, we decide ahead of time. We're told ahead of time by the supervisor what results we need to get. And we are expected and required to work the experiment, to put it nicely, to get those results. And so after he asked for a copy of this paper, he took that paper to the vice president of academic affairs. And he said, here's what one of the PhD students in this major cancer lab told me, and here's this paper. We may have a problem here. The vice president said, just leave it. Don't say anything about this, just leave it. And they just wanted to ignore it at first. But it reached a point over the next 2 years where it could no longer be ignored. And that very prestigious supervisor, who is no longer prestigious, was actually fired. And it was a big expose done as privately as possible, but word does leak out from time to time. And that's why I'm not naming the university. But this was going on right firsthand in a major university that I'm very well acquainted with.
And I don't think it's
nature.
Kirk, I don't think it's always one side either. If I think of like climate change, the fossil fuels groups, environmentalists, everybody's funding different groups of people, and they're all coming up with opinions or papers that support their belief structure to get their things across. And occasionally there will be a good neutral thing that's either funded by both parties or funded by neither party, that you might get a non-biased thing. But there's bias in everything. And I think this is part of the problem is you've got, and I'll take it out of science for a second, it's across everything. Religion, everything. There's biases everywhere. And, and this is where, like, when you put your faith in something, what are you putting your faith in? If you're putting your faith in Christians, I have really, really bad news for you. You're going to be really disappointed.
I'm a Christian. Okay. So I had 2 daughters, and I still have 2 daughters. They're married now and so forth. But if some guy was scoping out one of my daughters and I found out he was a Christian, doesn't mean a thing to me, because there are so many people who call themselves Christians who actually the way they live is totally at odds with what they claim they believe. So even within every area, we have biases. We have things we want to be true. Here's an example of a bias in science. So we have a problem with the origin of life. Origin of life scenarios are still in the realm of fantasy. Okay, so we have actually made, we don't have any reproducible thing. We have very little in the way of data results. And so this is a problem. Now, what is the problem with the origin of life scenario? Well, one of them is that to get a minimal genome, to get a very simple life form, you need a certain minimum number of proteins or protein coding genes. It might be, there's lots of different numbers been thrown around. Commonly, it's somewhere in the high 200s, maybe 280 genes. I've seen it low as, I think, 50 or even 30 genes. But here's the problem. So Eugene Koonin, who is an internationally distinguished evolutionary biologist, was working on this. And he finally concluded that the probability of getting RNA replication going is so small, it will never occur anywhere in the universe up to this time. If you say the universe is, let's say, 13 billion years old, it will never happen. It's just far too improbable. So this isn't the end of the story, but let me just pause for a second. This is a case of an inductive inference, where an inductive inference is based on probabilities. And when he looked at the probability of getting just the protein coding genes we need to build, or the RNA sequences we need for RNA replication, the probabilities there were so small, we should never expect it to happen. It would be irrational to think it will happen anywhere in the universe. And the major part of the problem is that they work on digital information. You require digital information to build these things. And nature is very poor at writing computer code. And essentially that's what the code that codes for proteins and genes and gene replication and regulation.
And I want to interrupt for a second, because you're getting into really deep stuff here. Do you have any background in this?
Well, yeah, it's I really took an interest in this aspect of things quite a few years ago. I did my PhD in, basically a couple of questions. How do you define information in genetics? How do you quantify it? And then how do you discover it? Let's say you have a section of DNA. How do you know where the information is in that DNA? Or proteins? How much information does it require to code for the average protein? What about this particular protein family? And then the major part of my research was, well, what does this information do in terms of protein structure? So that the concept of information I found was fascinating. And I thought, what happens if we apply this to biological life, especially genetics? And one of the major, I was very fortunate one day, I heard about this pattern discovery program that was useful for insurance companies. And what you do is you just dump a pile of data into this pattern discovery program, and it would point out what the probability was that this particular combination of car color, drivetrain, and all these other things, both the driver and so forth, you could start to see patterns on which would help the insurance company know who to charge more for insurance and who can get away with paying less. So I thought, what happens if I take a massive two-dimensional array of protein sequences and dump them in here? Will it discover any patterns? And the first run blew me right out of the water. And so this is where my whole PhD program centered around, was discovering these patterns. And these patterns translated back to the way the protein's three-dimensional structure is, and what parts of the protein are required to produce their function. And so most of the time we don't know what are the important bits of a protein in a three-dimensional structure and what parts are not so important. This revealed that. So back to what I was talking about, Eugene Koonin said this is not going to happen, and therefore there's only two options here. One option is that there's a mind behind the information encoded in the genomes of life, which he was not in favor of. Option two, if the probabilities are so fantastically small, close to zero, then there's no way that we will ever get life unless there's a near infinite number of universes. And so he published a paper arguing that there are an infinite or a near infinite number of universes, which is an inductive conclusion. So he has the problem here. We have something that there's only two ways to achieve the kind of information required to code for a protein. You can have an intelligent mind do it, which is a piece of cake. We can produce that level of information all the time in a standard email. Or if we're not going to allow intelligent minds, then chance. That's the only thing. So given enough time and enough universes, then eventually we will get not just one protein coding gene or one protein or one piece of RNA. We'll get all the ones we needed at the same time on the same planet, all in that universe. And then we got life. And his conclusion is we're the lucky winners of that fantastically improbable event. So what was interesting was the peer-reviewed, it was an open peer review. In other words, the not only published the paper, but they also published the reviewers' comments. And the reviewers' comments explicitly raised the concern that people who believe there's an intelligent mind behind life might use this as evidence. And the conclusion by Kunin was, no, I have shown that intelligence is not required for life if you have an infinite number of universes. And he's right. If you have a near infinite number of universes, then anything that has a probability greater than 0 is going to occur. I mean, I wish more of those improbable events. I wish that, there's a pile of gold just materialize on the floor here, recombinated from various elements in the atmosphere and so forth.
You're just in the wrong universe.
Yeah, I'm just in the wrong universe. But here's something else that the reviewer made. One of the reviewers said, he was uncomfortable with the conclusion, not because he likes the conclusion, basically, but the discussion was specifically on it. Was it an intelligent mind there amongst the reviewers? And they said, we can't let this paper be used as evidence that there's an intelligent mind required. And I wouldn't use it either. I think there's a much better approach if you want to test for intelligence. But they said, we have the opposite of Occam's razor happening here. Occam's razor is where you go with the simplest answer that will actually explain your results. The simplest one is more likely to be true than some wildly improbable complex Rube Goldberg type machine to achieve the same effects. And he says, this is the very opposite of everything we do in science. What he's essentially doing is postulating an infinite number of unseen, untestable entities to explain how we got life here. Whereas the intelligent side of the scenario just says, no, you can do it with a mind. If there's a mind encoding the digital information of life into the genomes, we can test that. In fact, right now, in science, it's the only option on the table that's reproducible, testable, and so forth. As we can actually make genetic code sequences with scientists. And we're starting to build artificial proteins. And that's an example of intelligent design in action. When you have scientists sit down, now admittedly we're plagiarizing from biological proteins because they're learning the secrets of what works where and hydrophobic residues versus the other sorts of, let's say, acidic residues and how those all come together to create a stable three-dimensional structure. We're slowly reverse engineering biological proteins. And with that knowledge, we're actually able to design very simple, crude proteins ourselves. And with time, we'll get better at that as time goes on. But keep in mind is that intelligence is what's producing these artificial proteins.
So let's go back to this question that Miraxatech put in early, and we need to get to these because the chat is degrading here into chaos, which is proving that evolution has no opportunity to happen here. Okay, I've heard this question before. What if you're just wasting your time with this whole religious thing?
Oh, you're going back to the first question that Marax answered. Yeah. So let me, oh yes, there you've posted the question. What if I'm wrong? I've chosen your one chance at life of this universe to dedicate your life to a myth. This saddens me. It shouldn't. I'm having a good time. And so the thing is if I was totally wrong and it turned out that there was no afterlife, I would never find out about it. Like if there is no survival of some sort of consciousness after death, then when you die, that's it, game over. And if you were wrong about how you lived your life, you'll never find out because you're done, you're gone. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is I have honestly considered should I become an atheist? Should I become an atheist? And that was a number of years ago. now, but I think I know too much. I just have to throw a lot of stuff out the window if I had to say I'm an atheist. Now, for example, um, self awareness. How, boy, there's just an explosion of information here, and I got to condense this down. Let me just maybe just focus on the question that he asked. So, what if I'm wrong? He would be sad. Well, don't be sad, because I have lived, let's say, I've lived slightly different ways in the course of my life. And what I have found is that the experience of actually experiencing the presence of God in my life is by far the most wonderful thing I've ever experienced. I mean, I've done a lot of fun things and great memories, like snorkeling on coral reefs, taking the last ski run of the day in the Rockies where the sun is setting. I just got a new telescope, for example. I was looking at Mars and Jupiter and Saturn just last week through my new telescope, and there's something awesome about that. And I've experienced the love of a woman now for 42 years. We've been married, and I would have to say that is itself an awesome thing. But what I've noticed is that the quality of my relationships, let's say with my wife and my children and my friends and my neighbors, is proportional to how well I'm doing in my relationship with God. So let's say there was no God and this was all my imagination. Well, it seems to have a great deal of just simply pragmatic utility about it, that it has greatly enhanced my quality of life. I don't concern myself in the least about dying. I'm ready to roll when that comes. Not that I got a death wish, because I do believe we also have missions to accomplish in this life. And so I'm having a good time doing it, even if this turned out to be totally false. But I think there's a good question behind this. Is one thing I think is useful sometimes is, what if what I believe is totally false? So let's take, there is no God, there is no mind behind the universe. Now let's apply this new discovery to some of the major questions we have in life right here. Let's say the moral question. So suddenly, like, we're always complaining about all the evil and injustice in this world, but that assumes there is some transcendent standard of beauty that's being violated, beauty and perfection that's being violated. If we're the ones who make up that standard, then let's say me personally, that wouldn't work very well, because the neighbor down the street might disagree with me. So then what do? Well, you have to appeal to a higher standard. What about the government? Should that make up the standard of what's right and wrong? Well, I think if you're as old as I am, you know enough about politics and the different parties and so forth, that there's no way. I think you want to have government making up the ultimate rules of right and wrong and justice. And you want them to do the best possible, but you even evaluate the goodness of a government on the basis of some higher standard. So when you say, well, our culture over here, maybe you're pointing to some sort of unwritten social contract. It's called contractarian view of ethics. That our culture is better than that one over there. The moment you say that, let's say North Korea, for example, the moment you say that, you're assuming there's even higher standard still that transcends civilizations, so that you can take each civilization and compare it to that ultimate standard. And so ultimately, if there is no God, there is no ultimate standard. And I would say probably what we would look at then is more of a Darwinian approach to what goes on here. And if you look at that way, Genghis Khan was probably the most successful human that ever lived, just by looking at the number of people today who carry his Y chromosome. And there's a couple of interesting papers published on that topic. So
we can get into a lot of that. What do you do if there is no real reason to exist? Well, what's the point of even worrying about the planet?
Well, ultimately, it's just all about me. Like, well, how can I have the best life here that I can? And some people will say, well, maybe you could help other people. Maybe,
why?
But not at my expense. You know, why?
Why would I do that? All right. Well, we are running to the end of our time here.
Too bad. We can come back to this one.
Yeah. Feel free. if you're watching this now or when it goes up on the archives, please, hey, at least you Canadians can communicate. Well, thank you for that compliment. I'm just glad you got through all the accent problems that we have up here. Very interesting takes for sure. I haven't heard some of these. That's why we're here. We want to communicate what we've thought through in our lives, and hopefully, if you are interested in hearing more, you can reach out to us. Feel free to comment. Put your questions in the chat. We'll continue these discussions every week. I won't be around next week, Kirk, but maybe we'll do one more before the end of the year here sometime.
No, actually, I think this was it.
Oh, this might have been it, yes.
And then I'm taking off for the rest of the month.
So this is it until sometime in January.
Yeah.
So we'll figure out when we're back. But send in your messages anyway, because we'll come up with some topics based on them. Great chat this week. It's YouTube. It degrades, but sorry.
Oh, there were so many things we could have talked about there. We'll have to come back to this.
But thanks for watching. Thank you for commenting. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, and hit the bell if you want to be notified when Kirk posts videos and stuff. And go to kirkdurston.com if you want to send Kirk an email directly, or leave a comment here, and we'll Kirk or somebody will respond to it, I'm sure. So thank you all for watching. My voice is gone. I've been fighting a flu for the last few days. So Merry Christmas to all of you. Mercs Tech, Serpa, everybody in the chat, Sledgehammer, even you. I know it's been a fun chat there. As a hockey referee, I don't even think I'd go between you guys. You guys are all good. All right, talk to you all later.
Bye for now.
See you in a month, I guess.
Yeah.
Got to actually hit the goodbye music.